This video will help you review what you need to know about Spanish grammar as you head into your first Spanish class at Fordham. I've divided it into noun topics and verb topics. Noun topics concern nouns and related words like adjectives and articles. And there's 4 things to talk about here: gender, agreement, position of adjectives, and possessive adjectives. Noun gender is one of the fundamental features of Spanish. Every noun is either masculine or feminine, and sometimes this is obvious and natural, like la madre, feminine, and el padre, masculine. But in most cases, the gender of a noun is arbitrary. I mean, why should a newspaper be masculine and a magazine feminine? But you can tell that they are because of the final O on periódico and the final A on revista. These are the most common types of evidence that a noun is masculine or feminine. Masculine nouns might also end in an R or an L, as in color or papel. Anything that ends in age is masculine. These all come from French. Spanish endings besides A that are feminine include ción as an acción, and anything in the tad, dad, tud family. If a word ends in an E, you can't tell whether it's masculine or feminine. You have to memorize it. And actually, there are some profession words ending with E, like estudiante or contable, which is an accountant. That could be either masculine or feminine. So you have el estudiante, la estudiante, and so on. This is a lot like occupational words like turista, which can be el turista or la turista, el dentista, la dentista. There are plenty of exceptions to the O versus A pattern, but it still works in most cases. Mano, back in Latin, was already feminine, and dia was already masculine. That's the kind of thing you just have to memorize. There's other exceptions. There are some words like moto, which are feminine because they come from a longer word that ends in an A. So la moto was originally la motocicleta. There's a bunch of masculine words that end in MA, and these are words that come from Greek, and they tend to be sort of intellectual words. El drama, el poema, el problema. There are other words that end in MA that are just normal, they're feminine. These tend to be more everyday words like la cama, which is the bed. The important thing about masculine and feminine is that it comes from the noun, but it applies throughout a sentence. So any other word that's associated with the noun has to be masculine or feminine as well as singular or plural. So in English, we say the architect is tall. It doesn't matter if the architect is male or female. And we can say the architects are tall. So we have tall, 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 and we have the. But in Spanish, everything has to agree. So el arquitecto es alto, la arquitecta es alta, los arquitectos son altos, las arquitectas son altas. And this brings a kind of a harmony into the sentence. It's useful in poetry also. When you're using an object pronoun, these also have to agree with the noun they're taking the place of. So if you say, I admire him, the architect is going to be lo admiro versus la admiro if it's a female architect. And in English, you can say, I admire them, but in Spanish, it has to be los or las admiro, depending on gender. In the sentences, el arquitecto es alto, etc., you're seeing the 4 different forms of the word the. I show these on the left. These are the 4 forms of the definite article, the. The indefinite article also has 4 forms. So a is going to be un or una, depending on gender, and some is going to be unos or unas, depending on gender. So these all have 4 forms. It's worth noting that Spanish uses the more than English, and it uses a less than English. So in English, we say love is blind, but in Spanish, it's el amor es ciego. in general, the article is used when talking about things that are concepts or abstractions. In contrast, in English, we say, I am a student. You don't do that in Spanish. It's just soy estudiante. So in general, more use of the and less use of a. Adjective normally come after the noun, as in los zapatos azules. There's plenty of cases where it becomes, where the adjective comes before the noun. In that case, it's often metaphorical, as in un gran presidente, a great president, as opposed to un presidente grande, who would be big. Or if it's a quantifier, diferentes libros, meaning various books, as opposed to libros diferentes, which would mean, books that are different. Or stereotypical adjectives, blanca nieve, white snow, or something that's subject, mala comida. If the food is actually bad, like rotten, you would say comida mala. But mala comida is the subjective impression. Possessive adjectives like my, your, his, our, etc. have two differences from English. The first is that because they are adjectives, they have to agree with the thing they are describing. So we say mi casa, singular, but mis casas, plural. So I'm just one person, but the houses are plural, so it has to be mis. If the possessive adjectives is nuestro or vuestro, that has to agree in both number and gender with the thing I'm describing. So when I say nuestro libro, our book, it's singular and masculine. And note that we is actually a plural idea because we are multiple people, me and my friend. But libro is singular, so nuestro has to be singular also. In nuestras casas, the word nuestras is feminine plural to agree with casas. The second thing that's different from English is that there's a huge ambiguity to the adjective su. It can mean his, her, their, or your, and including the two different kinds of your, singular or plural, of the formal. So this is the opposite situation from the usual one where you have one English word like to be that corresponds to multiple Spanish words like ser, estar, and I. So here you have multiple English words, his, her, your, their, that are all smushed together into the single Spanish word su. So if I say su casa, I don't know which it is. It could be his house, her house, their house, your house. You have to tell from context, or you might have to add some additional information like su casa de ella, so we know it's her house. Most Spanish grammar topics have to do with verbs. At a basic level, the most important concept is subject pronouns and the basic idea of conjugation that comes along with those pronouns. You should already know at this point the present tense conjugation, but I'll also cover some special topics that are fairly basic. In order to talk about subject pronouns and verb conjugation, it's helpful to know some grammatical terminology. So the verb form hablar is the infinitive. It's the one that we express with to in English, to speak, and it's the form that you'll find in the dictionary. And Spanish infinitives can end with an AR, an ER, or an IR. Every Spanish verb conjugation has 6 forms. 3 are singular, meaning just one person, and the other 3 are plural. Looking down this table, the first person pronouns and first person verb forms refer to the person who is talking, or that would be I, and maybe I have somebody with me, so that's we. The second person is for the person you're talking to, so those are the you forms, whether singular or plural. And the third person is for people that you are talking about, so that can be he, she, or actually it, and then in the plural, they. And Spanish is confusing because it also includes some you forms in the third person. So for AR verbs, The yo form, I, ends with O. Everything else has an A in it. And notice that all 6 forms are different from each other. This means that just from the verb form, you can tell who is the person who did this particular action. In this case, who speaks. This is very different from English, where we only have 2 forms in the present tense, speak and speaks. So you can say, I speak, you speak, we speak, they speak, you all speak. And you don't know, you absolutely have to use the pronoun in order to establish who is speaking. Whereas in Spanish, there is no need to say yo hablo, because the O of hablo already tells you that it is I who am speaking, who's speaking. Likewise, hablas, hablamos, etc. So that's a major difference from English, and that's why I put the pronouns in parentheses. The most obvious difference between the setup here in Spanish and English is that Spanish has so many words for you. So in terms of singulars, there's the informal you, which is tú, which has the S endings. There's the formal you, which you would use to speak to a professor, police officer, and that's the usted form, which takes, as I mentioned, the third person singular endings, just to be tricky. The plural of usted is ustedes, which means you all, and it has the same endings as they, ellos and ellas. And in Spain, there's also a different you all, which is the plural vosotros. And in Spain, in fact, they hardly use the formal usted and ustedes forms. But for you, as Spanish students in the United States, you're going to be using only ustedes. So since we don't have all these words for you in English, sometimes students get confused about how to answer questions. So if I'm asking a question of one person, I say, how are you? So the person I'm speaking to, I could say, ¿Cómo estás? Or ¿Cómo está usted? And in both cases, the person would answer with an I form, estoy bien. But if I'm talking to multiple people, I'm going to say, ¿Cómo están ustedes? That's plural. And then the logical answer is, estamos bien, a nosotros form. Hablar is an AR verb. Here I have conjugations in the present tense also of an ER verb, comer, and an IR verb, vivir. So if you look at comer, you still have the same O ending for yo, and in every other form, the A of AR verbs turns into an E. Going to the IR verbs, vivir, it's going to be the same as the ER, except for nosotros and vosotros, where you see the I. So vivimos, vivís. So we can now see the full scale of agreement in Spanish. If you have a sentence like, las casas son bonitas, casas, which is the subject of the sentence, is feminine plural, which means that las and bonitas also have to be feminine plural. And also, we're talking about the houses, which makes it third person and plural, so we have to say son. And then if later we refer back to the houses, for example, if we say, I admire them, then the las, also has to agree back with casas, being feminine and plural. For every action that you talk about, you have to say who done it. And that basically means that you need to conjugate each independent verb in a sentence. For example, los estudiantes hablan y la profesora escucha. Hablan belongs to los estudiantes and escucha belongs to la profesora. Or if you're talking about one person and you say mi amiga canta y baila, that's 2 separate actions. It's almost short for mi amiga canta y mi amiga baila. But if you have a complex structure to express a single action, then you only need to conjugate the first verb because that will say who done it. And the second verb stays in the infinitive. So we want to study. Queremos estudiar. We have to leave. Tenemos que salir. Are you going to rest? Vas a descansar. And that's a lot like English. We want to study. We have to leave. Are you going to rest? Spanish also uses the infinitive after prepositions. And sometimes this is parallel to English. So if I say somebody goes to the library in order to study, eso en Spanish, va a la biblioteca para estudiar. Para is a preposition, and you need the infinitive, estudiar. But in other cases, it doesn't go well with our English instincts. If I say, after I always rest after I exercise, or after exercising, after is a preposition, so we also need the infinitive. So in Spanish, we would say, siempre descanso después de hacer ejercicio. Now let's look at some special verb topics that hopefully you are familiar with. First, we have three verbs that mean to be, ser, estar, and I. We have stem changing or boot verbs, which is a kind of irregular. We have reflexive verbs, backwards verbs like gustar, and then I've included the fifth topic, agreement with también and tampoco, which isn't really a verb topic because it's covered in chapter 3 of our textbook, and we begin in chapter 4. In a previous Spanish class, you might have learned that ser means to be in a permanent sense and estar means to be in a temporary sense. This is actually a lousy way to learn these words, and I urge you to forget it if you have in fact learned it before. Because look at these examples. Juan es estudiante, él es joven. These are with ser, but they're not permanent characteristics. I mean, Juan is a student, but eventually he's going to graduate. Juan is young, but he's going to get older. Or if we're talking about the time or the date, son las tres, hoy es martes, well, pretty soon it's going to be 4 o'clock, and tomorrow it's going to be Wednesday, so that's not permanent. Then looking at estar, it absolutely covers things that are not temporary. If I say El Bronx está en Nueva York, well, that's pretty darn permanent. So please do not use the permanent temporary distinction. Instead, I recommend that you primarily look to the Latin origins of these words, and you don't have to know Latin. So the verb ser comes from the Latin verb esse, to be, and that's like English essence. So we use ser to describe or identify the essence of a person, of a thing, or a thing. So if you're talking about a person, their age, origin, physical traits, personality, profession, religion, etc., that's part of who they are, their essence. Or if you're talking about a thing, it might be size, color, material, ownership, who owns it. Again, that is the essence of the object. Estar did not mean stare, comes from stare in Latin, which did not mean to be, it meant to stand. And because it meant to stand, that's why in Spanish we use it for location, because where something stands is where it is. That's why we say estoy en Nueva York. And here we can see the nice contrast. If we're talking about Anita and we want to talk about her origin, that's an essence thing for her. So we say Anita es de Chicago. But if we want to talk about her location, that's in estar territory, and we say Anita está en Nueva York. Stare also sounds like the word state. That's where our word state comes from. And we also use estar to talk about states and conditions, such as something being wet, dirty, sad, tired, bored, ripe, broken, lost, etc. And these are often the result of a change. So something is wet, está mojado, because it got wet. Something is broken, está roto, because it got broken. Another state that something can be in is the state of an ongoing action. So we have what we call the gerund in Spanish, estoy hablando, estamos leyendo. That's I am talking, we are reading. So those ing things combine naturally with estar to express the ongoing state of affairs of what something is doing, or what someone is doing. Besides the esse stare thing, it can be also helpful to remember that ser is used for practically any information that you include in an invitation. So here we have an invitation for a quinceañera party, and this is a quinceañera party. It is for Linda. That is the essence of this event. So those are both es. When we talk about the date or time, that's also with ser. Es sábado, 31 de agosto. It es a las 6 de la tarde. Even in chapter 15 of our book, you'll learn that we use the verb ser, not estar, to talk about location of an event. So anything on the invitation comes out with the verb ser. The third verb that expresses the idea of being in Spanish is I. Actually, the infinitive is haber. And this is to be in the sense of existence, whereas whether it's singular or plural. So singular would be, for instance, hay un examen mañana, there is a test tomorrow, or plural, hay 17 estudiantes en la clase, there are. So you can see that we use the contrast with estar. So for existence, we say, hay muchos edificios bonitos en Fordham, there are many beautiful buildings. But if we want to talk specifically about their location, then we would use estar. Los edificios están en el campus central. So the question is always existence versus location. Unfortunately, ser and estar are both highly irregular verbs. The only way to learn them is by memorization, but you'll get a lot of practice because they are both very common. Another common, very irregular verb is ir, meaning to go. Voy, vas, va, vamos, vais, van, and all those V's represent a hostile takeover from another Latin verb, vadere, meaning to go or walk, and that's related to the English word wade. Another common irregular is the verb tener, to have, and you can see that go in the yo form. There's a lot of go verbs in Spanish. You also see the change from tengo, tienes, tiene, etc. This means that tener is an example of a very common verb pattern in Spanish, which is stem-changing verbs or boot verbs. Chapter 3 of our textbook introduces the verb querer, to want, and you can see that the E in the stem, so that's the first E in the verb, changes to an IE in the forms quiero, quieres, quiere, quieren. And notice that in all of those, that IE syllable is stressed. Whereas nosotros, vosotros, the stress falls on the verb ending, queremos, queréis, so it doesn't show the same change. We call these boot verbs because the irregulars follow a kind of a boot pattern. Another E to IE boot verb in chapter 3 of our textbook is preferir, prefiero, prefieres, prefiere. This is a nice example because you can see which E changes. It's the last one of the stem, the one before here, the IR ending. So since boot verbs can be AR, ER, or IR, it's really a kind of mental gymnastics because you have to be alternating between the original vowel and the changed one. So here, E and IE, you have to alternate between them and the stem, and at the same time, you have to get the ending right. That's why speaking Spanish makes you smart. You've probably already encountered some verbs that have reflexive counterparts. For example, the normal verb llamar means to call. So, for example, llamo a mis amigos. I call my friends. The reflexive verb llamarse means to call oneself. So when I say me llamo Judy Hoffberg, it means I call myself Judy Hoffberg, where me is the self part. And this, of course, means my name is. But we don't really say my name is, we're saying I call myself. When you conjugate a reflexive verb, you have to make sure to use the correct reflexive pronoun. So, me baño, I take a bath or I bathe myself. Te bañas, you take a bath or you bathe yourself. Se baña, nos bañamos, os bañáis, se bañan, etc. And the normal subject pronoun can be used, but it's optional. So you could say, if you want, nosotros nos bañamos. So we bathe ourselves. But as usual, we usually don't bother with the subject pronoun. So when you conjugate these verbs, you have to focus both on getting the correct reflexive pronoun and also the correct verb ending. They have to harmonize. You can see the same harmony when you use the infinitive form of a reflexive verb because they have to use the correct reflexive pronoun too. So I can say, voy al café para reunirme con amigos. So in the dictionary, you'll see the verb reunirse, which means to get yourself together with somebody. But I'm talking about me, you see the voy, and that's why I have to say para reunirme, in order to get myself together with friends. Or are you going to wash your hands? Vas a lavarte las manos. It's literally, are you going to wash yourself the hands? That's how Spanish does it. With body parts are not possessions. So you have to use the te. It harmonizes with the vas. A third person example, ella tiene que irse. Irse means to leave, and there it's third person, so we're using the same se as in the dictionary form. Queremos bañarnos, we want to take a bath, we want to bathe ourselves. Or siempre desayunan 15 minutos después de despertarse. So they always eat breakfast 15 minutes after, and again, this is different in English. We don't use the infinitive. In Spanish, we say después de despertarse, after waking themselves up, but in English, we say waking, or after they wake up. In Spanish, we need the infinitive, después de despertarse, but the pronoun always has to agree. I'm sure you've already run into the verb gustar, which expresses the idea of to like. However, technically, it doesn't really mean to like, it means to please. And that's why it comes out sort of backwards. So instead of saying, I like chocolate, which would be with yo and I guess gusto, you're really saying that the chocolate pleases me, or the chocolate is pleasing to me. That's why you say, me gusta el chocolate. Likewise, te gusta el chocolate, le gusta el chocolate, etc. The only thing that's changing is who is the chocolate pleasing to. So you don't use your regular pronouns like yo, you're using these pronouns, which are for indirect objects, because it's pleasing to me, to you, etc. And you can, if you want, start off with a mí, a ti, if you want to be emphatic, like a mí me gusta el chocolate. And you can also, sometimes for the sake of avoiding confusion, say specifically who likes something, like a María le gusta el chocolate, pero a Alberto no le gusta. So there you want to mention the name, but it's always with a, because it's pleasing or not pleasing to that person. So because chocolate is singular, we're using just the form gusta, gusta, gusta all the way through. It's third person singular. But what if you have something plural, like mosquitoes? So here's another verb which is backwards, molestar, meaning bother. And here with mosquitoes, the form you want is molestan. So you can say, me molestan los mosquitos. So the mosquitoes bother me. They bother me, plural, molestan. Likewise, te molestan, le molestan, etc. Spanish loves backwards verbs. There's a lot of them, and there's also uses besides just this basic one. Finally, I wanted to mention, because it is included in Chapter 3 of your textbook, and we start with Chapter 4, that when you agree with something, you use either también or tampoco, depending on whether you're in a positive or negative situation. So if I say, hablo español, and then add, mi padre español también, so I'm saying something affirmative. My dad speaks Spanish. But if I say, no hablo hindú, then I'm going to need a tampoco to agree with it. Mi madre no habla hindú tampoco.